Hello, I am Dr. LaDonna Osborn. Welcome to this next episode of the Daisy Washburn Osborn 100 Years of Life, Ministry, Influence. 100 years, wow. 2024 is the year that she would have turned 100. But she passed in 1995, and we're taking advantage of this year just to stop and recognize the influence of her life and to learn lessons from her experiences. And of course, from my perspective as her daughter, wanting to share some things that have not commonly been talked about, but that are so important, not only for women, but for people who love this ministry, who have followed the Teal and Daisy Osborn saga for so many years. So let's talk today about her influence within the structure of this ministry. We talked in the last episode about her experience with the Lord and traveling as a family and her role as a mother and a homemaker on the road doing the things that were necessary. One of the things that we did not talk about was that she became the advance person, the one that would go ahead to various nations to meet with the heads of state, with the pastors, to do the groundwork to prepare for these great crusades. You see, in those days, the Lord would really talk to them about which country to go to. These days, I go to cities where I'm invited, where all of the pastors will work together. So I go at the invitation when there are pastors that are hungry for souls. And that's the way things have evolved under my ministry. But when my mother and father were beginning, because they pioneered mass miracle evangelism, it hadn't been done before. And so they were reach into new territory. And she was the one who would go ahead and do all of the preparation work in those days. The national pastors didn't know how to do crusades. They knew how to go to the market and preach, but they didn't know how to do organized crusades. So she would deal with the government leaders. She would deal with the pastors and train them. She would get the permits. She would select the grounds. She would establish the committees. She would arrange for all of the advertising, meet with the printers, all of these details back in the 50s and 60s, 70s, and 80s during this season. She was always the advance person, and she would make 3, 4, up to 5 trips ahead to these nations before it was time for the crusade. Can you imagine in those days when there were no fax machines, there were certainly no cell phones, there was not really international telephone service that was dependable. So there was no way to set these events up except to get on a plane and go. And travel was not easy in those days. So this was a woman very courageous. Often I would go with her as I was a little older to do the advance work, but she would just head out there alone and do this amazing work. Well, simultaneous with this increase of face-to-face mass miracle evangelism events, what we called the Tools for Evangelism programs were being developed. Tools for Evangelism were resources, gospel resources that were produced in multiple languages that could be given to soul winners, to evangelists, to enhance their own desire to win souls so that they could be more effective in what they did for the kingdom of God. So this ministry has always been known not only for the mass evangelism crusades, but for the miracle films, for what we call the Big Ten, the crusade sermons in over 60 languages, the linguatape units, which were the battery-operated players that we would give with the set of 10 sermons, with all of these things, plus the vehicles with generators, big screens, rubber screens, to to allow the evangelists to go into villages, show the films, scatter the tracts, play the sermons, win souls, establish churches. It was a tremendous program. And then, of course, this included the National Evangelism program that was providing financial assistance to national preachers, men and women, who had graduated from Bible school, but they had no way to support themselves or their families. So this ministry stepped in to provide temporary financial assistance on two conditions. Number one, that the national preacher would go into a completely unreached area. Completely unreached. And secondly, that they would give their full time to gospel ministry. So with just a little assistance, so many nationals were able to go into unreached areas of their nations with the gospel, establish churches. Now, just as a point of statistic, we assisted over the decades over 30,000 of these national preachers, men and women, and we can calculate that at least 150,000 churches became completely self-supporting. This is an amazing statistic. I'm telling you this for a reason. And by the way, none of these churches had our name on them. All of the funds went through the organizations that were in those nations. So these new churches had the names of that organization or that church on them. But I'm telling you this because my mother, do you remember when I told you that she had a desire to learn business when she was in high school? And I told you this would be significant later. Now it comes into play. Because of her business acumen, she became, all through the years of the ministry, she was the senior executive administrator. And from the early days of the ministry, all the way through to her passing, she was that mind and that organized, that administrative genius that developed the policies, the programs, established the infrastructure of the ministry. And each of these evangelism programs that I enumerated to you, how do you operate them? How do you decide who to give them to? How do you raise money for them? How do you keep track of them? All of the administrative, how do you negotiate the purchase of tens of thousands of linguitape players? Who goes to an Asian nation, to a factory, to sit down and negotiate? You see, these are all just administrative tasks that my mother always handled for this ministry. And so these are things that are not commonly known. What you see pictures of in our books is the distribution of these things, not the behind the scenes. How were these shipments? How did they get through customs? How did it happen? What about these airplane loads of medical supplies? There's so many things that are really, yes, they're ministry, but they're administration. This was one of the key areas that my mother participated in the ministry and was the one, she was the genius behind so many things that we're known for today. And the policies continue. Do you know not one of the policies that she inaugurated has had to be edited or updated? Methods on many things have had to be updated because of technology, because of the growth of the national church, things that have changed. But the fundamental structure of how do you do this, they have stood the test of time. And this speaks to the gift that God gave to her at that time in the ministry. And so I just want you to know that you don't have to ever limit what God can do through you. You see, by this time, my mother she had survived a violent family. She had already made good choices in marriage. She had already endured crises and loss. By this time, she already had encountered the Lord and had required to hear his voice for herself. She had made a bold, unheard of decision to take her children and travel as a family around the world. And then you see, as the ministry begins to develop and grow, into the machine it is today that empowers ministers all over the world with gospel resources, tools for evangelism. You see that she has accomplished all of this. So I'm just wanting to remind you, don't limit God in what he can do through you. Don't end your growth after one success. Don't decide that you've achieved all that's possible. Keep stretching. Keep trusting the Lord, because what he can do through you, one person, you cannot imagine. But it's a matter of being obedient, hearing his voice, and going forward, regardless of circumstances, pressing through to enhance the kingdom of God, to win souls, and see the world change for Jesus Christ. So think about this, and let's remember Dr. Daisy Washburn Osborn, an example to us today.